frozen dip in the mountain road. The cold had worked its way through her wool coat 2 hours outside of Cheyenne, and hadn't left since settling deep into her bones like it had paid rent and intended to stay. She was 34 years old, a widow with $42 to her name, a carpetbag containing everything she hadn't been forced to sell or abandon, and a letter in her coat pocket from a man named Caleb Hart requesting a wife for practical purposes. The letter had been brief, economical. It said he needed a woman who could work, who wasn't prone to hysterics, and who understood that mountain life was not gentle. It said nothing about love. It said nothing about companionship. It read more like a job posting than a marriage proposal, and that God help her had been exactly why she'd answered it. She didn't need romance. She needed distance. She needed Wyoming between herself and Edmund Harcourt, and she needed it fast. The wagon lurched to a stop in front of what appeared to be a general store doubling as a post office, and the driver, a leathered old man named Pete, who'd said exactly 14 words to her since Cheyenne jerked his head toward the boardwalk without looking at her. "Harrow's Crossing," he said. That was word 15. Mary gathered herself, took a breath of air so cold it burned, and climbed down from the wagon with as much dignity as a woman her size could manage after 11 hours on a wooden bench in below-freezing temperatures. She landed heavy on the frozen dirt, steadied herself against the wagon wheel, and reached back up for her bag. That was when she heard it. Lord Almighty! The voice was loud, deliberately loud, the kind of loud that wanted an audience. They actually sent one, and look at the size of her. She didn't turn around immediately. She pulled her bag down, straightened her coat, and took one measured breath. "Charlie, you see this?" the voice continued. A second man laughed a mean, delighted sound. "Hart sent all the way to St. Louis for a woman, and they shipped him a hog." The laughter spread. Not everyone on that street. Not everyone, but enough. Enough that it filled the air and pressed against her from all sides. And she felt every head turn, felt herself become the spectacle she'd been dreading since she first read Caleb Hart's letter, and thought just for a moment that maybe this could be a fresh start. She set her bag down on the boardwalk. She turned around. The man who'd been speaking was maybe 40, red-faced, thick through the middle himself, wearing a wool vest that had seen better decades. He was grinning at his companion, gesturing toward her with a hand that held a half-eaten biscuit, pleased with himself in that particular way of men who've never once had to answer for their mouths. "Something funny," Mary said. He looked at her directly then, and the grin shifted into something harder. "Just remarking on Hart's taste is all. Man must be desperate or blind." "Which are you?" she said. "Desperate or blind? Because a man with good eyes and half a brain wouldn't stand in a public street mocking a woman he's never met." The grin disappeared entirely. His jaw tightened. He took one step forward, just enough to use his height, and looked down at her with the particular contempt of a man who had never once lost a public humiliation contest and didn't intend to start. "You'd best watch your mouth, woman," he said low and mean. "You don't know who you're talking to." "I know exactly what I'm talking to," Mary said. And then, before the calculation had fully finished in her mind, before the sensible part of her brain could remind her that she was a stranger in a strange town with no allies, no husband yet, and $42 between herself and ruin, her hand moved. The crack of it across his cheek echoed off the storefronts and died in the frozen air. The biscuit fell from his hand. He stumbled back into the post and grabbed it to keep from going down, and for one suspended moment, everything on that street simply stopped. Mary's hand stung. Her heart was going like a runaway horse. She kept her chin up and her eyes on him, and she did not move a single inch. "My name," she said in the clearest voice she had, "is Mary Sutton, and I will not be your entertainment." Nobody spoke. The wind moved. Somewhere further down the street, a horse shifted its weight and a harness jingled. And then from the doorway of the general store, a voice said, "That'll do?" It was quiet. Not loud, not commanding in the way of men who need volume to assert themselves. Just two words, flat and certain, and every head on that street turned toward them. The man in the doorway was tall, lean in the way of men who work rather than worry about it, wearing a dark coat over worn work clothes and a hat pulled low against the wind. He was maybe 35, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something harder than handsome, sharp jaw. Dark eyes that moved from the red-faced man to Mary and back with the slow economy of someone who didn't waste attention. A pistol on his hip, hands at his sides. He didn't step off the boardwalk. He didn't need to. The red-faced man straightened up, rubbed his cheek, and for a moment Mary thought he might push further. Then he looked at the man in the doorway, and something in his expression shifted just slightly, just enough, and he bent down, picked up his biscuit, and walked away without another word. The street exhaled. The man in the doorway looked at Mary for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not warmth exactly, not admiration. More like the careful reassessment of a man who had formed an expectation and found it insufficient. He stepped off the boardwalk and walked to her, stopping 2 feet away. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the way his jaw was set, the particular stillness of a man who had trained himself out of unnecessary movement. "Mary Sutton," he said. "Yes." "Caleb Hart." He picked up her carpetbag from the boardwalk without asking. "Wagons around the side. We leave in 10 minutes. He turned and walked away. Mary stared at his back. "Don't I get a moment to—" "You can rest on the trail," he said without turning. "It's 6 miles, and the light goes early up here." She stared at the space where he'd been standing. She looked at the street around her, the faces that were still watching. Some curious, some still amused, one older woman near the dry goods store, who gave her a look that might have been sympathy or might have been warning. She looked at the general store door and then at the direction Caleb Hart had gone. $42. Edmund Harcourt, somewhere behind her. A dead husband's debts and a packet of documents sewn into the lining of her carpetbag that could bring down one of the most powerful men in Missouri if they ever reached the right hands. She straightened her coat, smoothed her skirt, and followed Caleb Hart around the side of the building. The wagon was small, a work wagon, not a passenger conveyance loaded with supplies that had been purchased with the efficiency of a man who did not like to make 2 trips. Caleb was checking the harness on a dark horse with the focused attention of someone who trusted the animal more than most people. He didn't look up when she came around the corner. "You can ride up front," he said. "Or in the back with the goods. Makes no difference." "Up front," Mary said. He nodded once. She climbed up, no help offered, none expected, and settled herself on the bench. He finished with the harness, checked 2 things she couldn't identify from where she sat, and climbed up beside her with a single fluid movement that reminded her she was not dealing with a man of leisure. He clicked his tongue at the horse, and they moved. For several minutes neither of them spoke. Harrow's Crossing fell away behind them, the storefronts and the faces and the still echoing laughter, and the trail rose into pine and rock and silence. "That man," Mary said finally. "The one I slapped. Is he going to be a problem?" "Cleet Dunmore?" Caleb said. "He's always a problem. But not for you." A pause. "Least not while you're on my land." She absorbed that. "You knew him." "Know him well enough." His eyes stayed on the trail. "He runs his mouth at anything he figures won't bite back." He figured wrong. Something shifted at the corner of Caleb's mouth. Not quite a smile. Something that had once lived near the neighborhood of a smile and still knew the address. "He did," he said. The trail climbed. The cold deepened. Mary pulled her coat tighter and watched the pines thicken around them and tried to calculate as she had been calculating for 3 weeks, since she'd first read that letter, since she'd made the decision in the dark of her St. Louis boarding house room with Edmund Harcourt's shadow already reaching under the door, whether this had been the right move. "The letter said you'd been corresponding with a placement agency," she said. "How many women did you write to before me?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. 3. "And—" "First one took one look at the mountain and went back to Denver. Second one got here, saw the cabin and started crying. Didn't stop for 2 days." He paused. "Third one I didn't write to. Agency sent her without asking. She had 4 children she hadn't mentioned." Mary looked at him. "What did you do?" paid her train fare back, and wrote them a letter about their business practices. Despite everything, the cold and the aching back and the fading sting in her palm and the constant low-grade terror that had been her companion for 6 months, Mary felt something ease slightly in her chest. Not safety. Not yet. But the first faint outline of what safety might feel like. "I should tell you something," she said, "before we go any further." His eyes moved to her for the first time since they'd left town. Level patient, revealing nothing. "I'm not just looking for a fresh start," she said. "I'm running from something specific." She watched his face. "A man in St. Louis. His name is Edmund Harcourt. He's a lawyer, or he calls himself one. He's been running a scheme that's taken land from a dozen families in 2 counties, using fraudulent deeds, and county officials he's paid to look the other way. My late husband was one of the men he ruined." She paused. "Before Thomas died, he gathered evidence, documents, signed affidavits. He gave them to me because there was nobody else to give them to." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, the horse's hooves on the frozen trail, the wind through the pines. "And Harcourt knows you have them," he said. "He knows Thomas had something. He doesn't know exactly what or exactly where it is now." She looked at her hands in her lap. "But he will find out. Men like him always find out eventually, and when he does, he'll come." She waited for the reaction she'd been bracing for, the withdrawal. The calculation the particular way men had of deciding a problem was larger than they'd bargained for. She'd seen it before. She'd seen it on the face of Thomas's brother when she'd told him. She'd seen it on the face of the boarding house proprietor who'd quietly asked her to find other accommodations after Harcourt's men started asking questions on her street. Caleb Hart said, "If he comes, we deal with him." That was all. 4 words. No qualification, no caveat, no visible weighing of cost against benefit. He turned his eyes back to the trail and clicked his tongue at the horse, and they kept moving up the mountain as if she'd just told him it might snow next week. Mary looked at his profile for a long time. "You don't know what you're agreeing to," she said. "Neither do you," he said with that not-quite smile again. "That makes 2 of us." The cabin was not what she'd expected. She'd been preparing herself for worse, a 1-room shack maybe with a dirt floor and gaps in the boards, so when they came around the last bend in the trail, and she saw it, the size of it surprised her. 2 rooms visible from the front, solid log construction, a covered porch, a woodpile stacked higher than her head. A barn further back. Fencing she could see extending into the trees. Smoke from the chimney, which meant he'd banked a fire before leaving that morning. It was not comfortable. It was not warm in the way of a home that had been tended with care for its own sake. But it was solid. It had been built by someone who took their work seriously, who understood that in this country, the difference between solid and merely adequate was the difference between living and not. She climbed down from the wagon without help, stood in the yard and looked at it. "You built this yourself," she said. "Most of it. With my brother the first 2 years." A pause she didn't press. "He went back east." She didn't ask about the brother. Some silences told you more than answers would. Caleb unhitched the horse and led it toward the barn. Over his shoulder, without turning, kitchens through the left door. Fire should still be going. There's coffee if you want it. She went inside. The kitchen was small and ruthlessly functional iron stove, a table with 2 chairs, shelves of dry goods arranged with military precision, a single window that looked out at nothing but snow-dusted pines. The fire was low but alive. She added 2 logs from the stack beside it and stood close to it until she could feel her hands again. She looked at the room, at the single cup on the shelf, at the 2 chairs, one of which she suspected had never been sat in by anyone but Caleb Hart himself. She thought about Edmund Harcourt somewhere back along all those hundreds of miles of railroad and road. She thought about his face the last time she'd seen him standing in Thomas's parlor 2 days after the funeral, so certain of what she'd give him, so completely unprepared for what she'd done instead. She'd looked him in the eye and told him she didn't have what he was looking for. And then she'd walked out of that house with the documents sewn into her coat and not looked back. She'd been running since, and she was so tired of running. She poured herself coffee from the pot on the back of the stove. It was strong and slightly bitter, and the best thing she'd tasted in 3 weeks. Caleb came in from the barn 20 minutes later, stomping snow from his boots on the porch. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her at the table, both hands around the cup, and something passed over his face, too fast for her to read. "You warm," he said. "Getting there." He hung his coat and hat on the hooks by the door, and went to the stove and poured his own coffee. He sat down in the chair across from her, and they sat like that for a moment. Two strangers at a table in the mountains, the fire crackling between them, and a silence that wasn't exactly comfortable, but wasn't exactly uncomfortable either. "I should tell you," he said, looking at his cup, "what I can offer and what I can't. All right, I can offer you this land and this cabin. Protection and provision, fair treatment." He paused. "I cannot offer you ease. Life up here is work every day without exception. I can't offer you what most women expect from a marriage." Another pause longer. "I was in the war, 3 years. I came back." He stopped, and she watched him choose his words, the way a man picks his footing on uncertain ground. "Different. I don't always manage company well. There will be days I don't speak much, days the weight of things comes back, and I need distance." He looked up at her, then direct. "I won't apologize for it, but I won't lie about it either." She held his gaze. "My late husband liked to drink," she said. "He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't strong. The debt he died in wasn't all Harcourt's doing. Some of it was choices Thomas made when things got hard." She looked back at her cup. "I've been apologizing for somebody else's failings for so long, I've nearly forgotten what it feels like to just be myself." She paused. "I don't need ease. I've never had it. I need honest. I need fair. I need a man who means what he says and says what he means." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, with the finality of a man who has made a decision and will not revisit it. "Then I reckon," he said, "we can start there." It wasn't love. It wasn't even warmth, not yet. It was two people sitting across a table in the mountains, each of them carrying more weight than they'd admitted out loud to anyone in years. Both of them deciding quietly, separately, simultaneously, that maybe the weight was just slightly easier when there was another person in the room. Outside, the wind picked up. Inside, the fire burned. And Mary Sutton, who had slapped a man cold on the day she arrived in Harrow's Crossing, who had ridden 6 miles up a mountain with her future sewn into her coat lining, and a powerful enemy somewhere on her trail, who had answered a stranger's letter not because she believed in fresh starts, but because she had run out of any other kind. Mary Sutton sat in the kitchen of Caleb Hart's cabin and finished her coffee and felt for the first time in 6 months that she might have landed somewhere that would not give her up. She didn't know yet about the tracks she'd find in the snow 3 weeks later. She didn't know yet what Harcourt had already set in motion. She didn't know yet that the mountain she'd come to hide on was about to become the ground she'd fight on. But she knew one thing sitting there in that kitchen in the cold Wyoming mountains with a man who had looked at her and said without flinching, "If he comes, we deal with him." She knew she was done running. The first morning Mary burned the porridge, not slightly, not the kind of burn that could be scraped from the edges and salvaged with enough optimism. She burned it the way a person burns something, when they've been staring at it too hard, thinking too many things at once, letting their mind run ahead of their hands. The smell hit before she could do anything about it, thick and acrid, and she was still standing there with the wooden spoon when Caleb came in from the barn and stopped in the doorway. He looked at the pot. He looked at her. He didn't say a word. "I know," she said. "All right." He went to the shelf, took down a tin of hardtack, and set it on the table between them. They ate hardtack for breakfast in the same silence they'd managed the night before, that particular silence of two people who haven't yet decided what kind of silences they're going to be for each other. Mary chewed the dry biscuit and kept her eyes on the table, and told herself it didn't matter that she'd learned that the burning was a first-day problem, and first-day problems were always the worst kind. "I can cook," she said, because she needed to say it. "In a real kitchen, I know my way around a stove." "This is a real stove," Caleb said. The altitude does something. To the heat, to the timing. She paused. I'll figure it out. He didn't argue. He didn't reassure her either. He just looked at her with those level dark eyes and said, "There's an axe on the porch if you want to split wood this morning. Wood's low on the east stack." She stared at him. "You want me to split wood? I'm not telling you to. I'm telling you where the axe is." He stood up, took his coat from the hook. "Up to you what you do with your time." He went back out to the barn. Mary sat at the table for a long moment. Then she got up, went to the porch, found the axe, and went to the woodpile. She had never split wood in her life. She had grown up in Cincinnati, moved to St. Louis at 19, and spent 15 years in circumstances that, however reduced they'd become by the end, had never required her to stand in freezing Wyoming air and attack logs with a double-headed axe. She swung it wrong the first 6 times. The blade glanced off or buried itself at an angle, or the log simply rolled away in contempt. Her arms screamed. Her back, still complaining from the wagon ride, made its displeasure loudly known. She kept going. On the 9th swing, the log split clean. The 2 halves fell apart with a sound that she would not have predicted this deeply satisfying. She stood there, breathing hard steam rising from her coat, and looked at what she'd done. Then she set up another log and did it again. She was still there an hour later when Caleb came back around the corner of the barn. He stopped when he saw the stack she'd built, not large, not impressive by any working standard, but real. And that not-quite smile crossed his face again. "Hands," he said. She looked at her palms. Raw. 3 blisters already forming on the right hand, 1 on the left, that had already broken. "I'll get some leather strips," he said. "For tomorrow. Wrap them before you start, not after." "I figured that out on my own," she said. "I know. I watched you figure it out." He picked up 2 of the logs she'd split and headed toward the porch. "Lunch'll be salt pork and beans. I'll cook today." She followed him in, and if there was something that shifted between them in that moment, some small invisible weight that moved from one side of the scale to the other, neither of them remarked on it. But Mary felt it. She suspected he did too. 3 days in, she found the grave. She hadn't been looking for anything. She'd been following the fence line on the east side of the property the way Caleb had shown her, checking for breaks for posts that had shifted in the freeze when she came around a stand of pines and nearly walked into it. A wooden cross, simple and hand-cut, driven into the ground with a care that said something about the person who'd put it there. No name, just a date carved into the crossbar. 1871. She was still standing there when she heard Caleb's boots behind her. She didn't turn around immediately. "Who was it?" she asked. A long pause. "My wife," he said. She turned then. He was standing 10 feet back, hands in his pockets, looking at the cross, with the particular expression of a man who has made his peace with something, and still finds the peace insufficient. "I didn't know," she said. "I didn't tell you." He paused. "Her name was Clara. She came out here with me in '69. She was—" He stopped, chose again. She was brave, braver than she had any right to be given what she walked into. He was quiet for a moment. "Fever. 2nd winter. By the time I got her down the mountain, the doctor in town said there was nothing to be done." Mary didn't say she was sorry, because he didn't look like a man who wanted to hear that. She said, "Was it fast?" "No," he said. "It was not fast." She nodded once. She turned back to the cross and stood with it for another moment, the wind moving through the pines above them, and then she said, "She was brave to come up here with a man she barely knew." "Yes," Caleb said. "She was." They walked back to the fence line without speaking again, and Mary checked the posts with a thoroughness that had nothing to do with the posts, and they did not discuss Clara again that day. But something had shifted. Something had moved. He had told her something true without being asked, without dressing it up or protecting himself from it. In Mary's experience, men who could do that were rare enough to count on one hand. She was starting to suspect Caleb Hart was going to be difficult not to respect. By the end of the first week, she had stopped burning things on the iron stove. By the end of the second, she could split a cord of wood in 2 hours and carry water from the creek without stopping to rest. Her hands had calloused over the blisters, and the aching in her back had settled into a duller, more manageable thing. She slept deeply and woke before the light and lay in the dark, sometimes listening to the mountain, the wind, the creak of the logs, the occasional animal sound from the barn, and felt something strange and unfamiliar that took her 3 days to identify. She felt present. Not running, not calculating escape routes, not lying awake, measuring the distance between herself and Edmund Harcourt. Just present. In this cabin. In this cold. In this life that was hard and honest and exactly what Caleb Hart had told her it would be. It unnerved her, that feeling. She didn't entirely trust it. On the 14th day, Caleb set a rifle on the kitchen table without preamble and sat down across from her. She looked at it. "Why?" "Because if something comes at you and I'm not here," he said, "you need to know what to do with it." She didn't argue. She picked it up, checked the weight of it the way she'd seen Thomas do once years ago, and looked at Caleb across the table. "Show me," she said. He showed her. He was not a patient teacher in the conventional sense. He didn't repeat himself, didn't comfort her when she fumbled the reload, didn't soften his corrections. But he was precise. And precision, Mary was discovering, was its own kind of respect. He told her exactly what was wrong and exactly how to fix it, and then he let her fix it herself without hovering. She put her third shot through the center of the tin can he'd set on the fence post 30 feet out. Caleb looked at the can, looked at her. "You've shot before," he said. "Once, years ago." She lowered the rifle. "Thomas took me to a fairground. There was a shooting game." She paused. "I won a stuffed bear." Something that was actually a smile, a real one, not the near-miss version she'd been seeing, crossed his face and disappeared so fast she almost doubted it. "A stuffed bear," he said. "It was a very nice bear," she said. He stood up and took the rifle back, and she thought she heard him laugh low and quiet, heading back toward the barn. She stood at the fence in the cold and felt something warm in her chest that she told herself was nothing more than the satisfaction of hitting the target. She told herself that for 3 more days before she stopped pretending it was true. It was on a Tuesday. She was fairly sure it was Tuesday, though the days had begun to blur at the edges, the way they did when your whole life became the same 3 acres of mountain that the rider came up the trail. She heard the horse first. She was on the porch re-wrapping a split axe handle with rawhide, and she heard the hooves on the frozen trail below moving with a purposefulness that sounded different from the occasional deer or elk she'd learned to identify. She set the axe handle down and stood up and put her back against the cabin wall, the way Caleb had told her to. "If you don't know who it is, don't stand in the open," and waited. Caleb came out of the barn at the same moment she heard the trail creak under a horse's weight. He moved to the fence gate and stood there, one hand at his side, and waited. The rider was a boy. 16, maybe 17, thin as a fence post in an oversized coat, riding a brown mare that had seen better years. He pulled up at the gate and held out a folded envelope toward Caleb, with a hand that was shaking, whether from cold or nerves Mary couldn't tell. "From Sheriff Garrett, sir," the boy said. "He said it was important. Said to make sure you got it personal." Caleb took the envelope. He didn't open it immediately. "You eat today?" The boy hesitated. "This morning, sir. Go around to the back door. There's bread on the board and salt pork on the stove." He jerked his head toward the cabin. "Tell the woman inside I said to feed you." The boy looked at Mary on the porch, uncertain, and she said, "Come on then," and led him inside, and she was still heating up the pork when she heard Caleb's boots on the porch steps. She knew from the sound of them that whatever was in that letter was not good news. He came into the kitchen and stood with the opened envelope in his hand and looked at her across the boy's head, and the look on his face was the same one he'd had when he talked about Clara, that particular set of the jaw that meant he was deciding how much truth to give. "Wait outside," he said to the boy. Not unkind, just certain. The boy took his bread and his pork and went. Caleb laid the letter on the table. "Garrett got a wire from Cheyenne," he said. "A man named Edmund Harcourt filed papers in the county court 3 days ago. He's claiming you took property belonging to him when you left St. Louis." He paused. His lawyer is already in Harrow's Crossing. The warmth she'd felt in her chest, that dangerous, unfamiliar warmth, went cold so fast she felt it physically, like a door slammed open in winter. "He's faster than I thought," she said. "Garrett says the papers are legal, far as he can tell. Court documents. Property claim." Caleb looked at her. What kind of property? And so she told him the rest of it. The part she'd held back, the part that mattered most, not just that she had documents, but what those documents said. The names they named, the county officials Harcourt had bribed, the deeds he'd forged. The families, 7 of them, that Thomas had documented himself, who'd lost their land to legal maneuvers so precisely constructed that no single piece of it looked criminal unless you held all the pieces together at once. Thomas spent 2 years gathering it, she said. He knew he was dying. He knew Harcourt knew he was on to something. He sewed those papers into my coat the night before he died and told me to get them to a federal marshal. She looked at the letter on the table. "I've been trying to get to Denver ever since. Every time I get close, Harcourt's people show up." Caleb was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind moved, the fire cracked. The boy was sitting on the porch steps, probably cold, and Mary made a mental note to bring him something warmer before he rode back down. "Garrett," Caleb said finally. "He's a straight man. I've known him 12 years. If Harcourt's lawyer goes to him with those papers—" "He'll have to honor them," Mary said. "Legally, even if he doesn't want to." "Unless," Caleb said, "you have something that overrides them." She looked at him. "The documents," he said. "Where are they now?" She reached into the inside pocket of her coat. The coat she kept with her at all times, even inside, even at the table. The coat she would sleep in before she left it unguarded, and produced a folded oilskin packet the size of a man's hand, soft with handling and stained along one edge, with something she preferred not to think about. She laid it on the table between them. Caleb looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. "You've been carrying that the whole time, since the night Thomas died." He reached out and put his hand over it, not taking it, just covering it the way you'd cover something you intended to protect, and left it there. "Then we get it to a federal marshal," he said, "before Harcourt's lawyer can move. Garrett can't hold him off indefinitely." "No," Caleb said, "but he can slow him down. Garrett's good at slow." He stood up. "I'll ride down in the morning and talk to him. Tonight you put those papers somewhere in this cabin that isn't on your person, somewhere that won't burn and won't be found in a search." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "You trust me?" It was a direct question. He asked it the way he asked everything. No decoration, no maneuvering. Just the question itself in the open waiting. Mary looked at this man who'd fed a cold boy without being asked, who'd told her the truth about Clara without being pushed, who'd looked at a packet of documents that could bring down a powerful enemy and covered them with his hand. "Yes," she said. "I trust you." He nodded once. He opened the door and called the boy back in and gave him a warmer coat from the hook, his own spare and old brown wool thing, and sent him down the mountain with a verbal message for Sheriff Garrett that he asked Mary to listen to and confirm for accuracy. And she did. She sat at that table in the mountain dark with the fire burning and the oilskin packet beside her hand, and she listened to Caleb Hart speak to a boy messenger with the quiet authority of a man who had decided what was right and intended to see it done. And she thought about Edmund Harcourt, already in her county, already moving his pieces on the board. She thought about Thomas, about what it had cost him to gather that evidence, about the night he'd pressed that packet into her hands and looked at her with the only clear eyes she'd seen from him in years, and said, "Mary, whatever you have to do, get this to someone who can use it." She had not gotten it to Denver. She had not reached the federal marshal. She had landed instead on a mountain in Wyoming with a silent man and a cast-iron stove and blistered hands, and something growing in her chest that she still didn't have a name for. But she was still here. The packet was still here. And Edmund Harcourt had not yet found her. She put her hand flat on the oilskin and felt the crinkle of the papers inside all of it. Every name, every deed, every signed affidavit. and she made herself a promise in the mountain. Quiet, the same promise she'd made the night Thomas died, the same promise she'd been keeping since. She was not going to let him win. Not now. Not when she had finally stopped running. Not when she had finally, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, found somewhere that felt against all reasonable expectation, against every practical argument she could make, like it might be worth staying. Outside, the boy's horse disappeared down the trail. The sound of it faded into the wind and the dark. Caleb came back inside, shook the cold from his coat, and said without preamble, "Teach yourself to sleep light tonight." "I already do," Mary said. He looked at her, that long level look that she was learning to read, and something in it shifted just slightly. Something like the edge of a thing he hadn't said yet but was getting closer to. "I know," he said. "I've heard you." Caleb rode down the mountain before sunrise and was back before noon, and Mary knew from the way he tied his horse fast tight, no wasted motion, that what he'd found in Harrow's Crossing was worse than what they'd been hoping for. She was at the stove when he came through the door. She didn't ask. She waited. "Harcourt's lawyer is a man named Aldous Pruitt," Caleb said, hanging his coat and moving straight to the table. "Garrett says he's been in town 2 days, staying at the hotel, eating at the good table every meal and letting people know about it." He sat down. "He's already spoken to Judge Farley." "Farley," Mary said. "Is he?" "Straight far as I know. But Pruitt brought papers from a circuit court in Missouri. Property theft claims signed and sealed." He paused. "Garrett says Farley's going to have to act on them inside of a week unless there's a counterclaim filed first." Mary set down the spoon she'd been holding. "A week. 6 days now." She turned from the stove and looked at him across the table. "The documents I have, Thomas's documents, they're not just evidence against Harcourt. Some of them show that the property claim he filed is built on a forged deed. Thomas documented the forgery himself. He had a witness." She stopped. "The witness is dead, but the document is notarized. It should hold." Caleb's eyes sharpened. "Should. In a court where the judge hasn't been paid to look the other way." She sat down. "That's the problem. I don't know Farley. I don't know this territory. Back in Missouri, Harcourt had 3 judges in his pocket. He's had years to build that network. I don't know how far it reaches." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Garrett trusts Farley. That means something." "It means something if Farley's just honest," Mary said. "It means less if Pruitt's already had a private conversation with him." Caleb looked at her. "You're not easy about anything, are you?" "I was easy about things once," she said. "Then I watched a man use the law like a weapon for 3 years, and I stopped." He didn't argue with that. He pulled the letter from his coat, a second one this time, addressed to Mary herself, in a hand she didn't recognize, and laid it on the table. "Garrett found that in the Post this morning. It came on yesterday's stage." She picked it up. The return mark was Cheyenne. She opened it and read it twice, and both times the words sat in her stomach like stones. "It's from a federal marshal," she said. "Name of Cross. He says a contact in St. Louis told him I was heading to Wyoming. He wants me to come to his office in Cheyenne." She set the letter down. "He says he's been building a case against Harcourt for 2 years. He says my husband's documents could be the last piece he needs." Caleb stared at her. "There's already a federal investigation." "Apparently. And nobody told you." "Nobody knew to tell me." She looked at the letter again. Thomas had no idea. He was just a man who lost his land and decided someone should know the truth of it. Her voice caught slightly on the last word, just slightly, just enough, and she pressed her thumb against the edge of the letter and held it there until the feeling passed. He never knew there were others already working on it. Caleb reached across the table and put 2 fingers on the letter. "Then we get you to Cheyenne. Pruitt will try to intercept. If he knows about Marshall Cross." "Does he?" She thought about it. "I don't know. Harcourt's network is deep, but it's not perfect. If it were perfect, he'd have caught me in Kansas." She paused. "We have to move before he finds out." 3 days, Caleb said. Give me 3 days to arrange the trail down to Cheyenne without going through town. There's a southern pass that connects to the rail station at Coulter Junction. Pruitt won't be watching that way. You know the southern pass in this cold. I've run it in worse. He stood up. But first tonight I'm writing to Garrett. I want him to know about this letter before Pruitt has another chance to get to Farley. You're going back down tonight. Faster I move, the less time Pruitt has to react. He was already reaching for his coat. You'll be all right here. I'll be all right here, she said with enough certainty that he believed her. She could see him believe her, that small recalibration behind his eyes that happened when she said something that matched what he already suspected of her. He was gone before the sun started to fall. She did not sleep well. Not because she was afraid, or not only because she was afraid, but because the cabin was different when he wasn't in it, and that difference was something she hadn't anticipated and wasn't sure what to do with. She lay in the dark, listening to the mountain sounds, and thought about the marshal's letter, and thought about Thomas, and thought about the way Caleb had said 3 days with the absolute confidence of a man who had made harder calculations than this one. He came back at 2 in the morning cold all the way through, and she heard him at the door and called out, "It's open," before he could fumble for the latch, and he came in and stopped when he saw her at the table with a candle and the remains of the coffee pot. "Garrett's going to stall Pruitt," he said. "He's going to tell Farley there's a procedural question about the Missouri paperwork. Buys us maybe 4 days instead of 3. "Good," she said. "Sit down, there's coffee left." He sat. She poured. They sat across from each other in the middle of the night in the candlelight, and she thought that this was the strangest courtship in the history of Wyoming territory, and almost said so and didn't. "The night terrors," she said instead. "How long have you had them?" He went very still. "I heard you 2 nights ago," she said quietly. "Through the wall. You don't have to tell me what they're about. I just want you to know I heard." He looked at his coffee cup for a long time. Then he said, 7 years. "Since the war." "Since a specific day in the war." He paused. "There's a place in Virginia called Cold Harbor, June of '64. 3 minutes of fighting, 7,000 Union casualties." He stopped, started again. "I was a lieutenant. I had boys under me, 17-year-old boys." He didn't look up. "I got out. Most of them didn't. And I've never once been able to explain to myself why that was." Mary didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You don't have to explain it. It doesn't have an explanation." "No," he said, "it doesn't." He looked up at her finally. "Does that trouble you, knowing it's in this house with us?" "Thomas drank to kill his," she said simply. "Yours wakes you up in the night. I know which one I'd rather share a roof with." Something moved across his face. Something raw and unguarded there, and gone so fast that most people would have missed it. But Mary was watching, and she didn't miss it, and she filed it away in the part of her that was quietly, steadily against every practical argument learning this man. "Get some sleep," she said. "We've got 4 days." It was the next afternoon that Aldous Pruitt rode up the mountain. Mary heard him coming and was on the porch before he cleared the last bend in the trail. He was a compact man in a city coat that was wholly unsuited to the cold, riding a rented horse with the uncomfortable posture of someone who hadn't grown up around animals. He had a face like a closed fist, tight, purposeful, giving nothing away, and he sat his horse at the gate and looked at Mary on the porch with the particular assessment of a man who is deciding how hard a job is going to be. "Mrs. Sutton," he said, "not a question." "You have the advantage of me," she said. Aldous Pruitt, attorney at law representing Mr. Edmund Harcourt of St. Louis, Missouri. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "I have a court order directing you to return certain property belonging to my client. I'd like to discuss this matter in a civil—" "You can get off my land," said Caleb. He'd come around the side of the cabin so quietly that Pruitt's horse startled and shied 2 steps before Pruitt hauled it back. Caleb stood at the corner of the fence, hands at his sides, and looked at Pruitt with the flat, patient expression of a man who has already decided how this ends and is simply waiting for the other person to catch up. Pruitt recovered himself. "Mr. Hart, I presume. This doesn't concern you." "My land," Caleb said. "My wife." The word came out without hesitation, without self-consciousness, simply and factually, and Mary felt it land somewhere in her chest like a key in a lock. "That makes it my concern. Mrs. Sutton is not yet legally your wife." "She's standing on my property under my protection," Caleb said. "That's sufficient for this conversation." Pruitt looked at him for a moment, measuring. Then he looked at Mary. "Mrs. Sutton, my client is prepared to be reasonable. He asks only for the return of the documents Mr. Thomas Sutton took from his office without authorization. In exchange, he will drop the property claim, and you will be free to—" "Stop," Mary said. Pruitt stopped. "Those documents," she said, "were not taken from Edmund Harcourt's office. They were assembled by my husband over 2 years from Public Records County files and signed witness testimony. They belong to no one but the record of what was done and who did it." She came down one step of the porch. "And I will not be returning them. To you, to Harcourt, or to anyone else except the federal authority that has been waiting for them." The word federal landed. She watched it land. Pruitt's face didn't change. He was too trained for that, but something shifted in his posture, some microscopic tightening that told her she'd hit something real. "You've been in contact with a federal marshal," he said. Flat. "Certain." "I didn't say that. You didn't need to." He tucked the court papers back into his coat. "Mrs. Sutton, I would encourage you strongly to reconsider. My client is a patient man, but his patience is not infinite, and federal investigations—" He paused, deliberate, "have a way of stalling indefinitely when the primary witness cannot be located." The threat was silk over iron. She heard it perfectly. "Get off my land," Caleb said again, quieter this time, which somehow made it worse. Pruitt looked at him, looked at Mary. He turned his horse. "You have until Friday," he said without turning back. "After that, matters move out of my hands." He rode back down the trail, and neither of them moved until the sound of his horse had faded completely into the mountain. Then Mary said, "He knows about the marshal." "He suspected," Caleb said. "You confirmed it." I know I did." She pressed one hand against the porch post. "But he would have found out anyway. And now he knows we're not afraid of him." "Are you afraid of him?" She thought about it honestly. "I'm afraid of what he reports back to Harcourt," she said. "Harcourt doesn't send lawyers first. He sends lawyers first to find out if the problem requires something else." She looked at Caleb. "Pruitt's going to tell him we're not moving, and then Harcourt will send something else." Caleb came up onto the porch and stood beside her, looking out in the direction Pruitt had gone. "Then we leave for Coulter Junction tomorrow," he said. "Not in 4 days. Tomorrow. Garrett. I'll send word to Garrett tonight." He paused. "We pack light. We move fast. We get those documents to Marshall Cross before Harcourt has time to react to Pruitt's report." She looked at him. "You're willing to leave the mountain." "I'm willing to do what needs doing," he said. "The mountain will be here when we get back." When we get back. The words settled over her like something warm. They went inside, and she began to think through what she'd need: the documents, her coat, the rifle Caleb had taught her to shoot. And she was doing that thinking at the table when Caleb came in from checking the barn and stopped in the doorway with an expression she hadn't seen from him yet. "Come here," he said. The tone of it pulled her to her feet before she'd made the decision to stand. She crossed to the doorway, and he stepped aside, and she looked past him at the yard. Boot tracks, fresh ones in the snow beside the east fence line. Large. 2 sets, maybe 3 overlapping, and they didn't come from the trail. They came from the tree line to the north, which was not a direction anyone traveling honestly would come from. Someone had been standing in those trees. Someone had been watching the cabin. And the tracks were fresh enough that the edges hadn't softened in the wind. "When?" she said, though her voice was steadier than she felt. "Last night," Caleb said, "while I was in town." She stared at the tracks. She thought about lying in the dark alone, listening to the mountain telling herself she was all right. She thought about Pruitt's face when he'd said, "Matters move out of my hands." "He didn't wait for Friday," she said. "No," Caleb said. "He didn't." She turned back inside and went straight to the shelf where she'd been keeping the oilskin packet tucked behind a loose log in the back wall, exactly where Caleb had told her to put it. She pulled it out and held it in both hands and felt the weight of everything it contained. The years of Thomas's work, the names of the guilty, the evidence of everything Harcourt had stolen and broken and buried, and she made a decision. "We leave tonight," she said. "Not tomorrow. Tonight." Caleb looked at her for one long moment. Then he said, "I'll saddle the horses." They rode out at midnight with no lantern. Caleb had explained it simply before they left. Light tells them exactly where we are and how fast we're moving. Dark's our advantage, not theirs. And Mary had accepted that, with the same practical resolve she'd been applying to everything on this mountain since the first morning she'd burned the porridge. She rode close behind him, trusting his horse to know the trail her own animal couldn't fully see, keeping her breathing even, and her weight balanced and the oilskin packet pressed against her ribs inside her coat. The cold was absolute, not the manageable cold of a winter afternoon, but the deep, bone-seeking cold of a Wyoming mountain at midnight, the kind that found every gap in your clothing and worked its way through until your hands moved slow and your thoughts moved slower. She focused on Caleb's silhouette ahead of her and kept moving. They made it 2 miles before the first shot. It came from the left side of the trail, a single crack in the darkness close enough that she felt the air shift. Her horse lurched sideways, and she hauled the reins hard, staying in the saddle by instinct, more than skill, and heard Caleb's voice cutting through the dark before the echo of the shot had finished. "Off the horses, now, move right." She was off before she'd finished processing the words landing in the frozen scrub and moving right the way he'd said, and then he was beside her, one hand on her arm, moving fast and low. "How many?" she breathed. "Don't know yet. At least 2, maybe more." He pulled her against the rock face. They knew the southern pass. They were waiting. The knowledge of that hit her cold as the air. Pruitt hadn't just reported back to Harcourt. He'd already had men in position, which meant Harcourt hadn't sent Pruitt to negotiate, he'd sent Pruitt to locate. The lawyer had been a scout. "We can't go forward," she said. "No." "Back to the cabin." "Yes." He paused. "There's another way up, longer, but they won't know it." He looked at her. "Can you move?" "I can move," she said. "Then stay close and stay quiet." They left the horses. Caleb gave his a hard slap to send it back up the trail, trusting it to find the barn. Trusting that the sound of it moving would hold attention for a few extra minutes, and moved through the trees along the rock face in complete silence. She could hear her own heartbeat. She could hear the men on the trail, 2 voices low and sharp, arguing about where they'd gone. It took an hour and a half to cover the mile back up the mountain on foot in the dark. By the time they reached the cabin, Mary's legs were shaking from cold and exertion, and she would not have admitted it to anyone alive. Caleb went straight to the barn. She followed. "There's a shelf of rock above the north trail," he said, moving past the horses to the back corner, where he kept tools and equipment she hadn't fully inventoried. "About 100 feet above the main approach. I put it there when I built the cabin emergency measure in case of trouble." He pulled a canvas tarp back from something she hadn't seen before. Crates. 4 of them, old and solid, each one stenciled with markings she recognized from her time in St. Louis near the rail yards. Blasting powder. She stared. "You have blasting powder in your barn." "I cleared a lot of rock putting in the west fence line," he said. "Leftover." He looked at her. "I've been thinking about that shelf since Pruitt came up the trail. If Harcourt's men come from the north approach, the only real way to bring a group up here, they'll pass under that shelf for about 30 feet. She understood immediately. "You want to bring the shelf down. If they give us no other choice." He looked at her directly. "I want to be clear. That's a last measure. I will try every other thing first." "I know that," she said. "If it comes to it," he said. I need you on the cabin roof with the rifle covering the east approach while I manage the charge line from the west. I need to know you can hold the east alone for 10 minutes if necessary." She thought about the tin can on the fence post, the stuffed bear at the fairground. 3 weeks of practice on this mountain with this man who hadn't laughed at her for missing and hadn't praised her for hitting just showed her what was wrong and let her fix it. "I can hold the east," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded and went back to the crates. They worked through what remained of the night. Just before dawn, while Caleb was running the charge line from the barn to the base of the shelf trail, Mary went into the cabin and sat at the table and wrote a letter. Methodical, detailed, every name and date and document reference she could recall from memory. Not a duplicate of Thomas's papers, but a companion to them, her own account of everything she'd seen and done and been told since Thomas died. She addressed it to Marshall Cross in Cheyenne, and she sealed it with candle wax, and she put it in the center of the table. If something went wrong today, if neither of them got off this mountain, the letter would still be here, and someone would eventually come and find it. She was sealing it when Caleb came back in, cold, stiff, and focused, and saw what she was doing, and didn't say anything. Just looked at the letter, looked at her, and poured them both coffee. They drank it standing up. "There's something else I should tell you," Mary said. He waited. "In Thomas's documents there are names I never told you. Officials in the Missouri Circuit Court, a land commissioner in Jefferson City." She looked at her cup. "And one federal surveyor in Wyoming Territory who signed off on 3 boundary adjustments that shouldn't have been legal." She paused. "Harcourt's reach goes further than St. Louis. That's why he can file papers in this county that look legitimate. He's been building the groundwork out here for 2 years. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "That's why he came himself," he said. She looked up. "What?" "Garrett sent me a message last night before we left. Came with the same boy." He set his cup down. "He didn't tell me then because he thought we'd be on the trail to Coulter. Harcourt arrived in Harrow's Crossing yesterday evening. Came in on a private coach from Cheyenne." He paused. "He didn't come to file papers, Mary. A man like that doesn't travel to Wyoming in winter to file papers." The air in the cabin felt different, heavier. "He came to make sure it's finished himself," she said. "That's what it looks like," Caleb said. She set her own cup down very carefully. "How many men does Garrett think he has with him?" He counted 6 on the coach, plus Pruitt. 7 men. 1 lawyer. And Edmund Harcourt, a man who had spent 15 years building a machine that destroyed people quietly, legally, invisibly, had decided that machine wasn't working on Mary Sutton and had come to apply something less subtle. "He'll come today," she said. "Yes," Caleb said. "He will." "Then we don't wait," she said. "We use your plan and we finish this." He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she could see him thinking, could see him weighing everything, could see the veteran in him running the same calculations he'd probably run the morning of Cold Harbor and every significant morning since. "There's no coming back from it," he said quietly. "Once that shelf comes down, whatever's under it, that's permanent." "I know what permanent means," she said. "He came here to make me permanently gone. I intend to make his choice for him." Something settled in Caleb's expression. Not ease, not satisfaction, just the particular resolution of a man who has decided that some things have to be done and has made his peace with being the one to do them. "Roof," he said. "East side, rifle loaded." "Go," she said. They found positions. Harcourt's group came up the north trail just past 10 in the morning. She heard them before she saw them. 6 horses moving with the confidence of men who expected no resistance, who had been told this was a simple retrieval, a matter of property and legal authority, and a woman with nowhere left to run. She counted them from the roof flat against the cold shingles, rifle up. 6 riders, Pruitt on a borrowed horse at the back, and at the front, on a black animal that was considerably better than anything else on that trail, a man she hadn't seen in 8 months, but recognized from the way he sat a horse back straight, chin up, the absolute posture of someone who had never once expected to be refused. Edmund Harcourt looked exactly the same as the last time she'd seen him standing in Thomas's parlor, certain that grief and debt and fear would make her cooperative. He pulled up at the base of the trail below the shelf and called out without looking around, projecting his voice the way a man does when he's used to being heard in large rooms. "Mrs. Sutton, I've come a long way. I'd prefer to settle this conversation quietly if you're willing." Mary's finger stayed outside the trigger guard. She waited. "I have no quarrel with you personally," Harcourt continued. "Your husband involved himself in matters that didn't concern him. That was his choice. I'm simply here to ensure that certain documents which were taken without authorization are returned." A pause. "Come down and we can discuss the terms. I'm prepared to be generous." She looked across the yard toward the west tree line where she knew Caleb was positioned at the charge line. She couldn't see him, which meant Harcourt couldn't see him either. She stood up on the roof, slowly, deliberately. "Mr. Harcourt," she called down, "those documents are already in federal hands." The silence that followed was the most satisfying sound she'd heard in 8 months. Then Harcourt turned to the man beside him and said something low and fast, and the man reached for his rifle, and Mary dropped back flat against the roof, and the shot went over her by 6 feet, and she heard Harcourt's voice sharp and furious, "Not yet, you idiot, not yet!" And then she heard something else. Caleb's signal. 3 short whistles, low and fast, the way a man calls a dog home. They were in position. They were under the shelf. She got to the east edge of the roof and sighted along the rifle and put a shot into the frozen ground 2 feet in front of the lead horse's hooves. The animal reared screaming and threw its rider, and for 15 seconds, Harcourt's 6 men were all moving, wheeling, yelling, grabbing for rifles and for reins. And in those 15 seconds, in the chaos and the noise and the cold morning air, the shelf came down. The sound of it was not like a shot, and not like thunder, and not like anything Mary had a word for. It was the sound of the mountain making a decision, a deep grinding final crack, and then a roar that built from below and rose and kept rising, and the north trail disappeared under rock and snow, and the ancient weight of the cliff face that Caleb had split at its weakest point. The ground shook, the cabin shook. The horses still in the yard screamed and pulled at their lines. And then there was silence, the kind of silence that comes after something that cannot be taken back. Mary lay on the roof and breathed. She was shaking not from cold, not from fear, but from the simple physical fact of having been in her body during something enormous. She made herself breathe through it. 1 breath. 2. Then she climbed down. Caleb met her at the corner of the cabin. He was covered in dust, and his face was blank in the way faces go blank when something has happened that the mind needs time to process. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then he said, "Are you hurt?" "No," she said. "You?" "No." They looked toward the North Trail together, or where the North Trail had been. Through the settling dust, one figure was moving, stumbling, not riding, working his way back up the destroyed path on foot. Aldous Pruitt, coatless, one hand pressed to a cut above his ear, alive and pale as chalk, and looking at the destruction around him with the expression of a man whose entire understanding of a situation has just been revised. He stopped when he saw them. Mary walked toward him. Caleb fell into step beside her. Pruitt looked between them. He looked back at what was behind him. He opened his mouth. "Don't," Mary said. He closed it. "You're going to ride back to Harrow's Crossing," she said. "You're going to tell Sheriff Garrett everything you saw today. Every name, every instruction your client gave you, every piece of this." She stopped 2 feet from him. "And then you're going to decide whether the man who sent you here was worth the rest of your career? Because I promise you the documents I've already sent to Marshall Cross include details of every lawyer and official Harcourt has paid in 3 states. She paused. "Your name may or may not be in them. How cooperative you are today will go some distance toward making that question simpler." Pruitt looked at her for a long, long moment. He looked at the rock and the silence behind him. He looked at Caleb, who had not said a word and did not need to. "My horse," Pruitt said. His voice came out ragged. I need my horse. It's at the bottom of the trail, Caleb said. It ran when the shelf came down. You'll find it. Pruitt turned and started walking. Mary watched him go. She stood in the cold mountain air with Caleb beside her, and she watched Aldous Pruitt pick his way down the destroyed trail and disappear around the last bend. And she stood there a little longer after he was gone, looking at the place where Edmund Harcourt had been. She had seen powerful men before. She had watched Thomas be destroyed by one. She had watched Harcourt move through Missouri like weather inevitable impersonal, leaving ruin behind him and calling it business. She had spent 8 months running from his shadow. The mountain had not hated him. It had simply been what it was, and he had not survived it. She felt Caleb's hand settle on her shoulder, brief, solid, certain, and then he took it away, because he was Caleb, and he didn't hold on longer than was needed, and she was beginning to understand that about him, that he didn't perform anything. Everything he gave was real. We need to get word to Garrett, she said. Yes. And then to Marshall Cross. Yes. She turned away from the North Trail and looked at the cabin. Her letter was still on the table. The fire was still burning. The coffee was probably cold. Caleb, she said. He looked at her. We're going to need to make more coffee, she said. And that quiet, almost smile crossed his face, the real one, the one she'd learned to watch for, and he said, I reckon we are. And they walked back inside together. Sheriff Boyd Garrett was a man who had seen most things that Wyoming Territory could produce in 20 years of wearing a badge, and he stood in the doorway of his office and looked at Mary Sutton and Caleb Hart, and said nothing for a full 10 seconds. Then he said, Pruitt got here an hour ago. What did he tell you? Caleb asked. Enough. Garrett stepped back and let them in. He was a broad man, gray at the temples, with the careful eyes of someone who had learned to measure truth by how much it cost the person telling it. He looked at Mary with those eyes now not unkind, not suspicious, just measuring. He says Harcourt is dead. Yes, Mary said. He says the North Trail up to your mountain doesn't exist anymore. It does not, Caleb said. Garrett looked between them. Then he pulled out a chair from behind his desk and set it in front of Mary with a deliberateness that said something about the kind of man he was. Sit down, Mrs. Sutton, he said, and tell me all of it. Start to finish. Leave nothing out. She sat down. She told him. It took 40 minutes. Garrett didn't interrupt. He sat behind his desk with his hands folded and his eyes on her face, and he listened the way good lawmen listen, not for what they expect to hear, but for what's actually being said. She told him about Thomas, about the documents, about Harcourt's network and the forged deeds and the 7 families in 2 Missouri counties who'd lost their land to legal manipulation so precise it looked like bad luck until you held all the pieces at once. She told him about Edmund Harcourt arriving at Thomas's parlor 2 days after the funeral, about leaving St. Louis with a packet sewn into her coat and 6 months of running, about Marshall Cross's letter, about Pruitt's visit to the mountain and the boot tracks in the snow and the decision to leave that night and the ambush on the southern pass. When she was done, the office was very quiet. Garrett unfolded his hands. The documents, he said. Where are they now? Mary reached into her coat and laid the oilskin packet on his desk. He looked at it. He looked at her. You've been carrying that through all of it. My husband spent 2 years gathering that information, she said. He died before he could do anything with it. I wasn't going to let it disappear. Garrett picked up the packet carefully, the way you'd pick up something you understood the weight of. He turned it over once in his hands. Then he set it down and reached for a pen. I'm going to wire Marshall Cross this afternoon, he said. I'm going to send him a full account of what happened on that mountain, including Pruitt's statement, including this. He tapped the packet. I'm also going to send a wire to the circuit court in Missouri, informing them that the property claim filed by Edmund Harcourt is hereby contested on grounds of fraudulent origin. He paused. In my professional judgment, which I am prepared to put in writing, there is no legitimate legal claim against you, Mrs. Sutton, None. Something loosened in Mary's chest. Something she'd been holding so long, she'd forgotten it was held. There'll be a formal process, Garrett continued. Cross will have to take the documents file with the federal court. It'll take some months. But, he looked at her steadily. You're not running anymore. You understand that. That's done. She understood it. She sat with it for a moment and let it be real. Thank you, Boyd, Caleb said, quiet and direct. Garrett waved a hand. Don't thank me. She did the work. I'm just the man with the telegraph. He stood up. One more thing. He hesitated slightly, which from Garrett was the equivalent of someone else delivering a speech. I want to say in my official capacity and my personal one that this town did not treat you right when you arrived, Mrs. Sutton. I saw what happened on the street. I should have stepped in sooner than I did. He looked at her straight on. I'm sorry for that. Mary looked at him. She thought about the boardwalk and the laughter and the way every face had turned toward her like she was the day's entertainment. She thought about standing there with her bag in her hand and her heart hammering and deciding in that instant that she would not for anything, not for anyone pretend to be less than she was. You sent the boy up the mountain with the letter, she said, and you stalled Pruitt when it mattered. That counts for something. Garrett nodded once. It was enough. They walked out of the sheriff's office into the main street of Harrow's Crossing, and Mary felt the difference before she could name it. The street was going about its business horses at the hitching posts, a woman coming out of the dry goods store, two men talking outside the barber, but something in the way eyes moved toward her had changed. Not the frank, gleeful assessment of her first arrival. Something more careful. Something that recognized it had made an error and was in the process of quietly revising. Cleet Dunmore was sitting on the bench outside the hotel. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. The red-faced man who'd mocked her in front of the whole town, whose cheek still carried, she was satisfied to observe a faint yellowish trace of the bruise she'd left him with. He looked at her. She looked at him. He didn't speak. Neither did she. But something passed between them in that silence, a reckoning clear and complete, and he was the first to look away. Caleb noticed. He said nothing. But she felt his pace beside her settle into something slightly more deliberate, and she understood that this was what it meant to have someone in your corner who didn't need to announce themselves. The wire from Marshall Cross came back the same evening. Garrett sent the boy up to the mountain with it, the same boy who'd ridden up 3 weeks ago in Caleb's spare coat. He handed it to Mary at the door and accepted a slice of bread with butter in exchange, and she read it at the table while Caleb watched her face. Cross confirmed receipt. He confirmed that Thomas Sutton's documents together with 2 years of federal investigation were sufficient to file criminal charges against Edmund Harcourt's surviving associates and the officials in 3 states who had been on his payroll. He confirmed that Mary was not under any legal claim and that her assistance to the federal investigation would be formally noted. He said he expected to close the case within the year. He said he was sorry about her husband. She folded the wire and set it on the table. That's it, Caleb said. That's it, she said. He watched her face. How do you feel? She thought about it honestly, the way she'd learned to think about things since coming to this mountain without performance, without protection. Like something that's been wound tight for a very long time, she said, just stopped. He nodded slowly, like that was exactly the right answer. The weeks that followed were different from the weeks before, though the work was the same. She still split wood, and hauled water, and practiced with the rifle, and burned things occasionally on the iron stove. The mountain was still cold, and the trail to town was still long, and Caleb was still a man who expressed more through action than words. But the quality of everything had changed the way light changes when clouds move same world, different weight. He started teaching her other things. How to read trail signs. How to identify which way water ran under frozen ground. How to patch a fence post in ice so it would hold until spring. Small things, practical things, the kind of knowledge that only matters if you're planning to stay somewhere for a long time. She noticed he'd started saying, when spring comes, instead of when the season changes. She noticed she'd started saying it too. One evening in late February, she was at the table writing a letter to Thomas's sister in Cincinnati, telling her for the first time the full truth of what Thomas had done, and what it had cost, and what it had ultimately meant when Caleb came in from the barn and sat across from her and watched her write for a moment. "Thomas's sister," she said without looking up. "She deserves to know he was brave." "He was," Caleb said. She looked up at that. "You never met him?" "No, but a man who spends 2 years building a case against someone that powerful, knowing what the risk is, knowing it might kill him." Caleb paused. "That's not nothing. That's a lot of something." She looked at him. "He wasn't always brave," she said honestly. "But at the end he was." "Most people are better at the end than they were at the beginning," Caleb said, "if they're lucky enough to have time to try." She held his gaze for a moment. Something in it, something in the particular steadiness of it, the way he looked at her like she was simply completely real, made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She looked back down at the letter. "You're in a philosophical mood tonight." "I'm in a talking mood tonight," he said. Which from Caleb Hart was approximately the same thing. He was quiet for a moment. She finished the sentence she was writing and waited. "There's something I want to say," he said. "I want to say it right, and I haven't done much of this kind of talking, so I'd ask you to bear with me if it comes out rough around the edges." She set down her pen. "When I wrote that letter to the placement agency, he said I was looking for something practical, someone who could manage the work, someone honest, someone who wouldn't require things I didn't have left to give." He paused. "I wasn't looking for—" He stopped. Chose again. "I wasn't looking for what you turned out to be." "And what did I turn out to be?" she said softly. He looked at the table, then at her. "Someone who slaps a man in the middle of a public street on her first day in a new territory," he said, "and doesn't blink afterward." Despite herself, she laughed. A real laugh, unguarded, and she saw the effect of it on his face, that warmth he couldn't quite hide anymore. The one that had been growing for weeks behind all that careful stillness. "Someone," he continued more quietly, "who carries a dead man's justice across 6 states in her coat and doesn't put it down. Who learns to split wood and shoot a rifle and haul water and stand on a cabin roof in the middle of a fight and hold the east side alone." He paused. "Someone who sat across this table from me on the first night and told me the truth when she didn't have to." She was very still. "In spring," he said, "I'd like to marry you, properly, with Garrett and whoever else you want to witness it, if you're willing." The fire cracked. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. Mary Sutton looked at Caleb Hart across the table, at this man who had never once asked her to be smaller, who had met her exactly where she was, and moved beside her, rather than ahead of her, who had covered her husband's evidence with his hand, and said, "If he comes, we deal with him," before he knew the half of what he was agreeing to. And she thought about the woman who had stepped off a wagon in Harrow's Crossing in the middle of winter with $42 and a packet of documents, and the certainty that she was out of options. That woman was still here. She hadn't gone anywhere. She was still large and still broad-shouldered and still moved through the world, taking up exactly the space she required, and nobody on this mountain had ever once suggested she should take up less. She was still the woman who had slapped Cleet Dunmore across the face in front of a whole street of people and stood her ground. She was still the woman who had buried Thomas's work in her coat lining and run for 6 months rather than let it die with him. She was still all of that. She was also now the woman who knew how to read trail signs and split a cord of wood in 2 hours and hold the east side of a cabin with a rifle, while the man she trusted brought a cliff down on their enemy. She was the woman who had stood in the ruins of it and felt not triumph, not joy, but something cleaner and truer than either the simple absolute clarity of a person who has stopped running and decided to stand. "Yes," she said. Caleb nodded once with the finality of a man who has asked a question he already knew the answer to and is glad to have it confirmed. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his brief solid reel, and then he stood up and went to put another log on the fire. Spring came slowly to that mountain. It always did. But it came. By April, the North Trail had been partially cleared by a work crew Garrett organized enough to make it passable. Though the cliff above it was gone forever, and the mountain wore that absence, the way it wore everything, without apology, without explanation, simply as fact. Garrett filed the last of the federal paperwork on a Tuesday morning and sent word up the mountain with the boy who had started making the ride regularly enough that Caleb had given him a standing invitation to use the barn whenever the weather turned. Marshall Cross came to Harrow's Crossing in May. He was a spare, serious man from Denver with a reputation for finishing what he started, and he sat in Garrett's office with the oilskin packet open on the desk and went through every page with the concentrated attention of a man who had been waiting 2 years for this exact document. When he was done, he looked at Mary across the desk and said, "Your husband was a thorough man." "Yes," she said. "He was. The case will move forward. I expect indictments within 6 months." He paused. "I want you to know what you did carrying this, protecting it. It matters. It's going to matter to a lot of families who lost things they thought were gone for good." She thought about the 7 families Thomas had documented. The names on the pages, ordinary people, landowners, men who'd built something and watched it taken apart by paper and legal maneuver and the quiet practiced cruelty of power. She thought about Thomas in the last year of his life, sick and frightened, and still sitting at that desk every night building the case piece by piece, because he believed that the truth properly documented could outlast the people who wanted it buried. "Tell them," she said to Cross, "that a man named Thomas Sutton is the reason." Cross wrote it down. They were married on the first Saturday of June in the yard behind Garrett's office, with a minister from the church on the east side of town, and a gathering that was smaller than some and larger than the two of them had expected. Garrett was there. The boy in Caleb's coat, whose name was Danny, and who had somewhere along the way become a fixture in their lives, was there. The older woman from the dry goods store. The one who